The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashford House with the sort of pale, reluctant quality that seemed appropriate for a marriage without warmth. Alexander Thornfield, the 7th Duke of Ashford, stood in his study, one hand resting against the cool marble of the mantelpiece, his eyes fixed upon the gardens below where his wife walked alone among the roses. She moved with the same quiet grace she had possessed on their wedding day 3 years prior, a grace that had first captivated him in the drawing rooms of London, when he had been a younger man, less burdened by the weight of duty and the shadows of memory. Her gown was a soft blue, the color of forget-me-nots, and though he could not see her face from this distance, he knew the expression she would wear, patient, gentle, hopeful. It was that hope that tormented him most. "Your Grace," his secretary's voice interrupted from the doorway, "the correspondence from Parliament has arrived. They require your presence in London by week's end." Alexander turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Very well. Prepare the arrangements." As the secretary withdrew, Alexander's gaze returned to the window, but Catherine had disappeared from view, likely retreating to the conservatory where she spent her afternoons reading or attending to her correspondence. She wrote letters frequently, to her sister in Hertfordshire, to friends from her season in London, to charitable organizations she supported with quiet determination. She was, by every measure, an exemplary duchess, and he had not touched her in 18 months. The memory of their last intimate evening together rose unbidden in his mind, and he forced it away with the same rigid discipline he applied to all thoughts that threatened his carefully maintained control. He had his reasons, good reasons, reasons rooted in the darkest period of his life, before Catherine, before the title had fully settled upon his shoulders like a mantle of iron. His brother's death had taught him that love was a weakness, a vulnerability that could destroy a man from within. Richard had loved too freely, trusted too completely, and when his young wife had died in childbirth along with their son, Richard had followed within the year, consumed by grief that no amount of fraternal devotion could diminish. Alexander had sworn, standing at Richard's graveside in the rain, that he would never allow himself such weakness. He would marry as duty demanded. He would be respectful, honorable, kind, but he would not love. He would not allow that particular madness to take root in his heart. Catherine had seemed the perfect choice. Beautiful, yes, but more importantly, serene. She had accepted his proposal with a gentle smile and had never demanded more than he offered. Her family was respectable, her dowry appropriate, her temperament undemanding. He had believed, in his carefully calculated way, that their marriage would be one of mutual respect and comfortable distance. He had not anticipated the way she would look at him each morning across the breakfast table, as though he were not merely a duke, but a man worthy of tender regard. He had not anticipated the soft, "My love," she would murmur when she bid him good night, her hand lingering just a moment too long upon his sleeve. He had not anticipated the slow, insidious way her presence would begin to matter to him, the way he would listen for her footsteps in the corridor, the way her absence from a room would make that space feel hollow. So he had withdrawn. Gradually, deliberately, he had created distance, separate chambers, extended trips to London, polite conversation devoid of anything personal, and most critically, he had ceased all physical intimacy. Knowing that such contact would only weaken his resolve, Catherine had accepted this too, with the same patient grace she brought to everything. But lately, perhaps for the past several months, something had begun to change. The hope in her eyes had dimmed. Her "my love" had become less frequent, her tone when she spoke it less certain. And this morning, when they had encountered each other in the breakfast room, she had addressed him simply as "Your Grace," before quietly excusing herself. He told himself it was for the best. This was what he wanted, a wife who understood the nature of their arrangement, who did not expect what he could not give. Yet standing there in the cold light of his study, watching the space where she had been, Alexander felt something uncomfortably close to loss. The evening brought with it a dinner obligation Alexander could not avoid. The Marquis of Waverley and his wife were visiting from their estate in Kent, and Catherine had arranged the dinner with her usual meticulous attention to detail. The dining room glowed with candlelight, the table set with the Ashford silver that had graced ducal tables for 4 generations. Catherine presided over the meal with the ease of a woman born to such responsibilities, though she had come from a family of far more modest means. She conversed with Lady Waverley about the upcoming season in London, about mutual acquaintances and charitable endeavours, while Alexander discussed matters of estate management with the Marquess. But beneath the civilized surface of polite society, Alexander found himself acutely aware of his wife in a way he had not permitted himself in months. The candlelight caught in her dark hair, which she had arranged simply but elegantly. Her voice, when she laughed at something Lady Waverley said, had a musical quality that seemed to resonate in his chest, and when she glanced at him, which she did less frequently than she once had, there was a guardedness in her eyes that had not been there before. "The Duchess has been speaking of the improvements you've made to the tenants' cottages," Lord Waverley remarked, drawing Alexander's attention. "She seems quite devoted to the welfare of the estate." "Indeed," Alexander replied, his gaze moving to Catherine. "My wife takes her responsibilities very seriously." Catherine met his eyes across the table, and for a moment something flickered in her expression. A question, perhaps, or a challenge, but she merely inclined her head graciously. "The people of Ashford deserve a landlord who considers their welfare. I am merely doing what any duchess should." "Not any duchess," Lady Waverley interjected warmly. "I know many who consider the tenants beneath their notice entirely. You're a credit to the title, my dear." Catherine smiled, but the smile did not quite reach her eyes. "You are kind to say so." After the meal, as was customary, the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, while the gentlemen remained for port and cigars. Alexander found the conversation with Waverley tedious, discussions of politics and hunting that required only half his attention. The other half remained in the drawing-room with Catherine, wondering what she and Lady Waverley discussed in the privacy of female company. When they finally rejoined the ladies, Alexander found Catherine standing by the pianoforte, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, though she was not playing. Lady Waverley was admiring a portrait on the wall. Alexander's grandmother, a formidable woman who had ruled Ashford with an iron will for 40 years. "Will you play for us, Your Grace?" Lord Waverley asked Catherine, gesturing toward the instrument. Catherine hesitated, her eyes moving to Alexander as though seeking permission or perhaps something else entirely. He gave a slight nod, and she settled onto the bench with a rustle of silk. Her playing had always been one of her accomplishments, not showy or virtuosic, but deeply felt. She chose a piece by Chopin, something melancholy and searching, and as the notes filled the drawing room, Alexander found himself unable to look away from her profile, from the concentration in her expression, from the emotion she poured into the music, that she could not seem to express in words. When the piece ended, there was a moment of profound silence before the Waverleys applauded warmly. "Exquisite," Lady Waverley declared, "truly exquisite. You are a woman of many talents, Duchess." "You are too generous," Catherine replied softly, rising from the bench. But as she turned away from the pianoforte, Alexander saw her hand tremble slightly, and he understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that the music had been a form of speech, a message he was meant to hear, but had been too fortified against feeling to properly receive. The Waverleys departed shortly after, expressing their gratitude for the evening's hospitality. Alexander and Catherine stood together in the entrance hall, side by side but not touching, as the carriage pulled away into the darkness. "It was a lovely evening," Catherine said quietly, her gaze fixed on the now empty drive. "Lady Waverley is always such pleasant company." "You managed it well," Alexander replied, the words formal, distant. Catherine turned to look at him then, and in the dim light of the hall her expression was impossible to read completely, but there was something in her eyes, a weariness perhaps, or a decision being made. "Alexander," she began, and the use of his Christian name startled him. She so rarely used it anymore. "May I speak with you? In the library, perhaps?" Every instinct he possessed urged him to decline, to retreat to his study and the safety of solitude. But something in her tone, a quiet urgency, made him nod. "Of course." The library was dark save for the fire burning low in the grate. Catherine moved to stand before it, her back to him, her silhouette outlined in gold and shadow. Alexander remained near the door, maintaining the distance he had so carefully cultivated. "I have been considering," Catherine began, her voice steady but soft. "The nature of our arrangement. Our marriage." Alexander's chest tightened. "Catherine, please," she interrupted gently, turning to face him. "Allow me to finish. I have been a dutiful wife, have I not? I have managed your household, attended to your tenants, represented the Ashford name with all the dignity it deserves. I have asked for very little in return. You have been exemplary in every way," Alexander said, "and meant it." "Then I hope you will understand," Catherine continued, her hands clasped before her in a gesture that betrayed her nervousness. "When I tell you that I can no longer continue as we have been, I do not speak of separation or scandal. I merely mean that I must protect my heart from further injury." "Catherine, I have never wished to injure you." "I know," she said, and there was a terrible kindness in her voice. "You have never been cruel, Alexander. You have never been anything but courteous and correct, and that perhaps is the greatest injury of all. To be treated with such careful indifference by one's own husband, to lie awake wondering what fault exists in oneself that makes one so undesirable." The words struck him like a physical blow. "You have no fault. The failing is entirely my own." "Then help me understand it," Catherine said, taking a step toward him, her eyes searching his face. "Help me understand why you have built such walls between us, why you no longer—" Her voice caught and she drew a breath before continuing. "Why you no longer come to me as a husband should. Why you look at me as though I am a stranger you must tolerate, rather than a wife you chose." Alexander felt the foundations of his carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack. "There are reasons." "What reasons?" Catherine pressed, and now there was a tremor in her voice, a hint of the pain she'd been holding back for months. "What have I done that merits such coldness? What crime have I committed that warrants this exile from your affections?" "You have done nothing wrong," Alexander said, the words torn from him. "This is not about you. Catherine, it has never been about you." "Then what?" she whispered. "What stands between us that cannot be named?" For a long moment, Alexander stood frozen, caught between the need to speak and the terror of revelation. In the firelight, Catherine looked impossibly young, impossibly vulnerable, and he realized with a shock that ran through him like lightning that he had hurt her deeply, this woman who had only ever shown him kindness. "I cannot," he said finally, the admission raw. "I cannot give you what you ask. I cannot allow myself to feel what you wish me to feel." Something shifted in Catherine's expression. Understanding, perhaps, or the final fracture of hope. She nodded slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, harder somehow, as though she had made a decision in that moment that would change everything. "Then I release you from any obligation to pretend," she said quietly. "I will continue to be your Duchess in all public matters, but I will no longer wait for something you cannot give. I will no longer call you my love, for we both know it is a lie." She moved past him toward the door, and Alexander found himself reaching out, his hand catching her arm. The first time he had voluntarily touched her, in longer than he could remember. She stopped, looked down at his hand, then up at his face. "Catherine," he began, but had no words to complete the thought. She gently extracted her arm from his grasp. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, and the formality of the address felt like a door closing forever. Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving Alexander alone in the library with the dying fire and the sudden, terrible understanding that he had just lost something irretrievable, though he had convinced himself he never wanted to possess it in the first place. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, feeling for the first time in years the crack in the armor he had built around his heart. A crack through which something cold and desolate was beginning to seep. Fear, not of loving her, but of having pushed her away so effectively that she would never return. And in the silence of the library, with only the settling of embers to mark the passage of time, Alexander Thornfield, 7th Duke of Ashford, began to understand that his carefully constructed walls had become his prison, and he had locked himself inside, just as his wife had finally stopped knocking at the door. The rain came. Before dawn, a persistent drumming against the windows of Alexander's study, where he had remained throughout the night, unable to contemplate returning to his chambers. He had not slept, but had instead sat in the leather chair that had belonged to his father, and his grandfather before him, staring into the darkness and remembering things he had spent 3 years trying to forget. Richard had been the golden son, the heir everyone loved, charismatic where Alexander was reserved, warm where Alexander was cautious. Richard had moved through the world with an ease that Alexander had never possessed. Their father had died when Alexander was 12 and Richard 15, and Richard had stepped naturally into the role of future duke, leaving Alexander to find his place in the shadows, a role he had accepted without resentment, for he had loved his brother deeply. When Richard married Eloise Tremaine at 22, it had seemed the natural culmination of a perfect life. She was beautiful, lively, adored by everyone who met her. Their wedding had been the social event of the season, and Alexander, standing as Richard's groomsman, had watched his brother's face as Eloise came down the aisle and had seen something that both awed and frightened him. Complete, unguarded devotion. "I never knew one could feel this way," Richard had told him later, during the wedding breakfast, his eyes never leaving his new bride. "As though one's heart exists outside one's body, walks and breathes, independent of one's will. I would die for her, Alex, without hesitation, without question. Is that not the most terrifying and wonderful thing you have ever heard?" Alexander had smiled and raised his glass, but even then, at 19, he had felt a whisper of unease. Such intensity seemed dangerous, as though the universe would demand a price for such happiness. The price had come due within 2 years. Alexander closed his eyes against the memory, but it came anyway, vivid and merciless. The urgent summons in the middle of the night, the ride through the rain to Richard's estate in Gloucestershire, the midwife's grim expression, and then Richard's face, broken, destroyed, as he held Eloise's lifeless hand in the room that smelled of blood and death and shattered dreams. The child, a son, had survived only hours. Richard had held him once, this tiny, perfect boy, before surrendering him to the nurse who would prepare him for burial beside his mother. She was everything, Richard had whispered, standing in the rain at the graveside 3 days later. "Everything, Alex. And now there is nothing, do you understand? Nothing remains." Alexander had tried to comfort him, tried to be the support his brother needed, but Richard had been beyond comfort, beyond reach. He had retreated into Eloise's rooms, surrounded himself with her possessions, and refused all company save Alexander's. And even with Alexander, he spoke only of her, of memories, of regrets, of the unbearable agony of continuing to exist in a world she had left. "Do not do this," Alexander had pleaded one night 6 months after the funeral, finding Richard in Eloise's study, drunk and weeping. "Do not let grief destroy you. She would not wish this. You know she would not. What she would wish is irrelevant," Richard had said, his voice raw. "She is gone, and I am meant to what? Pretend to care about estate management? Attend balls in London? Marry again, perhaps, as everyone suggests? Create another child? To replace the one I lost?" He had laughed, a terrible sound. "I cannot, Alex, I cannot do any of it. There is a hole in the center of my being where they used to reside, and nothing will ever fill it." 3 months later, Richard had developed a fever. The doctor had called it influenza, but Alexander had known better. His brother had simply stopped fighting, had surrendered to the grief that consumed him, and within a week, Richard was gone, leaving Alexander alone with a ducal title. He had never expected to inherit, and a lesson he would never forget. Love was destruction. Love was weakness. Love was the certain path to unbearable pain. As dawn broke grey and wet over Ashford, Alexander finally left his study, moving through the silent halls of the house like a ghost. He had not intended to walk past Catherine's chambers, but his feet carried him there nonetheless, and he found himself standing outside her door like a supplicant at a shrine. There was no sound from within. Perhaps she slept. Perhaps she too had lain awake all night, considering the conversation in the library and what it meant for the future of their marriage. "I will no longer call you my love, for we both know it is a lie." The words haunted him, because they were not a lie, not entirely. He did care for her, far more than was safe, far more than he had intended. He admired her grace, her intelligence, her quiet strength. He found comfort in her presence, even as he denied himself the right to seek it. And yes, he desired her. though he had buried that desire beneath layers of duty and fear. But caring and desiring were not the same as loving. Love was what had destroyed Richard. Love was the enemy he had sworn to guard against. Except now, standing outside Catherine's door in the grey morning light, Alexander began to wonder if perhaps he had been guarding against the wrong enemy all along. Catherine did not appear at breakfast. Her maid informed Alexander with careful neutrality that Her Grace was feeling slightly unwell and would be taking her breakfast in her rooms. Alexander accepted this with a nod, suspecting the illness was more emotional than physical and knowing he was the cause of it. He spent the morning attending to correspondence and estate matters, but his concentration was fractured, his thoughts returning again and again to the conversation in the library. Catherine's words, Catherine's pain, Catherine's decision to stop pretending there was affection, where he had shown none. It was what he wanted, he told himself: distance, safety, the preservation of his carefully controlled heart. But if it was what he wanted, why did it feel so much like loss? Near noon he glimpsed her from his study window, walking in the garden despite the intermittent rain. She wore a cloak of deep green, and she moved slowly among the wet roses, occasionally pausing to touch a bloom or examine the leaves. Even from this distance, he could see the weariness in her posture, the way she held herself as though bracing against some invisible weight. He had done that to her. He had taken a woman who once smiled freely and laughed easily and turned her into this pale, careful creature who walked alone in the rain because the house itself had become unbearable. Alexander set down his pen and made a decision he immediately questioned but could not unmake. He would go to her. He would attempt, however inadequately, to explain. Not everything. He could not speak of. Richard could not excavate that pain even for Catherine, but something. Enough to help her understand that the fault lay in him, not in any inadequacy of hers. He took his coat and hat and descended to the garden, his heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm that he recognized after a moment as nervousness. He could not remember the last time he had felt nervous approaching his own wife. Catherine did not hear him at first, so intent was she on examining a rose that had been damaged by the rain. When he spoke her name, she startled, turning to face him with wide eyes. "Your Grace," she said, and the formal address stung more than he had anticipated. "I did not expect you. May I walk with you?" he asked, aware that it was likely the first time in a year he had made such a request. She hesitated, then nodded, pulling her cloak more tightly around herself. They walked in silence for several moments, the only sounds the drip of water from leaves and the distant call of birds. Alexander searched for words, for some way to begin the conversation that would not immediately reveal too much. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally, the words stiff but sincere. "For my behavior, for the distance I have maintained between us." "You owe me nothing," Catherine replied quietly, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Our marriage is what it is. I was foolish to expect more." "You were not foolish," Alexander said, stopping and turning to face her. "You expected what any woman has the right to expect from her husband: affection, companionship, intimacy. The failure to provide these things is entirely mine." Catherine met his gaze, and he saw the careful guard she had erected, the protection she had finally learned to build around her own heart. "Why?" she asked simply. "If the failure is yours, then help me understand its origin. Are you repulsed by me? Do you harbor some secret affection for another? Is there a physical impediment you have been too proud to disclose?" "None of those things," Alexander said, the admission coming easier than he expected. "You are beautiful, Catherine. Impossibly so. And there is no other woman, has never been another woman since the day I chose you." "Then what?" she pressed, and there was a tremor in her voice now, the careful control beginning to crack. "What is it that makes touching me so abhorrent to you that you have not done so in a year and a half?" Alexander drew a breath, feeling the words rise up from some deep, protected place. "It is not abhorrent, it is terrifying." Catherine blinked, clearly not having expected this answer. "Terrifying? I do not understand." "To touch you," Alexander said, each word difficult, painful, "to allow myself to feel what such touch would inevitably create. It would be to surrender control I have maintained for years. It would be to make myself vulnerable in ways I swore I would never permit again." "Again?" Catherine repeated, seizing on the word. You speak as though you have loved before. Not I, Alexander said. My brother. And then, haltingly, with great difficulty, he told her. Not everything. He could not speak of finding Richard drunk and weeping, could not describe the emptiness in his brother's eyes during those final months, but enough. He told her of Richard and Eloise, of their happiness and its destruction, of the way grief had consumed his brother like a disease until there was nothing left to consume. I watched him die of love, Alexander said, his voice raw. I watched it destroy him as surely as any physical ailment, and I swore, standing at his grave beside Eloise's, that I would never allow myself such weakness. I would marry, I would fulfill my duty, but I would not love. I would not give another person that power over my existence. Catherine stood very still, rain beginning to fall again, dotting her cloak with darker green. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. So, you chose to live only half a life, to protect yourself from potential pain by ensuring you would never feel true joy. Yes, Alexander admitted. And did it never occur to you, Catherine continued, that in doing so, you guaranteed your own suffering, that you traded the possibility of grief for the certainty of emptiness? Alexander had no answer for this, because of course it had occurred to him in the long nights alone in his study, in the moments when he heard her laugh from another room and felt something in his chest. Contract with longing. But acknowledging that would be to acknowledge that his careful philosophy had been flawed from the start, that he had been a coward rather than wise, that he had hurt them both for nothing. I have made mistakes, he said finally. I can see that now. But Catherine, I do not know how to unmake them. I do not know how to become the husband you deserve. The mechanisms of protection I have built, they are so deeply entrenched that I do not know how to dismantle them. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, rain falling between them, and he saw in her eyes a complexity of emotions, anger, pain, pity, and perhaps something that might once have been love, but had been too battered to survive unchanged. At least now I understand, she said quietly. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps knowing that the coldness came from fear rather than disdain makes it easier to bear. Catherine, I must go in, she interrupted, pulling her cloak more tightly around herself. I am quite wet, and the rain shows no sign of stopping. She moved past him toward the house, and Alexander felt the same desperate urge to reach for her that he had felt in the library. But this time he restrained himself, knowing that one brief touch would not begin to repair the damage he had done, that his sudden desire for connection was too little, too late. He watched her disappear into the house, a figure of green against the grey stone, and felt the rain soak through his coat, cold against his skin. And standing there in the garden they had walked together, Alexander realized with crystalline clarity that he had been a fool. He had believed he was protecting himself from loss by refusing to love Catherine. But in truth, he had been losing her every day in small increments through his own deliberate neglect, and now perhaps he had lost her entirely, not to death or tragedy, but to his own cowardice. The irony was so bitter he could taste it. In trying to avoid the fate of his brother, he had created his own form of grief, one that walked and breathed beside him, wore silk gowns and played Chopin with heartbreaking beauty, and no longer called him my love. He had been so certain that he understood the nature of suffering, that he had learned the essential lesson from Richard's tragedy. But he had been wrong. The lesson had never been to avoid love. It had been to recognize its value, to understand that some risks are worth taking because the alternative cares not safety but slow starvation of the soul. And by the time he had learned this truth, standing alone in the rain with the ghost of his brother's voice echoing in his memory, it might already be too late. The summons to London arrived 3 days later, as Alexander had known it would. Parliament required his attendance for a vote on new agricultural reform measures, and his presence was expected at several social engagements that accompanied the parliamentary session. Normally, Catherine would have accompanied him. A duchess was expected to maintain her place in society, but in the strained atmosphere that had settled over Ashford since their conversation in the garden, Alexander found himself uncertain whether to extend the invitation. He need not have worried. Catherine resolved the matter herself. I shall accompany you to London, of course, she announced at breakfast. her tone perfectly cordial, perfectly distant. It would be improper for the Duchess of Ashford to be absent from the season, and Lady Pemberton has written to say she is hosting a ball in a fortnight. Our attendance is expected. If you would prefer to remain at Ashford, Alexander began. I would not, Catherine interrupted, meeting his eyes with a level gaze. I have duties in London just as you do. Whatever arrangement exists between us privately need not affect our public obligations. It was a statement of fact, delivered without emotion, and it struck Alexander as infinitely sadder than tears, or recriminations would have been. She had accepted the reality of their marriage and had decided to fulfill her role with dignity, asking nothing more of him than courtesy and public respect. It was everything he had once thought he wanted. It felt like ashes in his mouth. They departed for London on a grey morning, travelling in the ducal carriage with its elaborate crest emblazoned on the doors. Ashford House in Mayfair had been opened and prepared for their arrival, the staff assembled and ready. Catherine had overseen all the arrangements with her usual efficiency, and the house gleamed with polish and fresh flowers when they arrived. Alexander found himself assigned to the ducal suite in the East Wing, while Catherine took the Duchess's apartments in the West, an arrangement that was traditional, but which now seemed to emphasize the chasm between them. He stood in his dressing room that first evening, preparing for a dinner at Lord Harrington's, and wondered when the geography of their marriage had become so definitively mapped, with such clear borders between his territory and hers. The dinner was tedious but necessary, filled with political discussion and strategic conversation. Catherine sat beside Lady Harrington, conversing gracefully about topics of feminine interest, while Alexander engaged in debates about agricultural policy and trade agreements. They performed their roles flawlessly, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, a perfect aristocratic partnership. Only, Alexander knew that when their carriage had brought them home, and they had bid each other formal good nights in the entrance hall, Catherine's eyes had been impossibly sad, and his chest had ached with something he could not name. The Pemberton Ball was to be the premier event of the early season, and all of London society would be in attendance. Catherine spent 2 days working with her modiste on her gown, a creation of ivory silk with delicate gold embroidery that Alexander glimpsed only briefly when he encountered her in the hallway outside her apartments. "You look beautiful," he said, the words escaping before he could consider them. Catherine paused, her hand on the door. "Thank you, Your Grace." The formality of her address was like a blade between his ribs, but he merely nodded and continued on his way, hearing her door close softly behind him. The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth, and the Pemberton mansion blazed with candlelight and music. Alexander and Catherine arrived together, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they ascended the stairs, a touch necessitated by propriety, but devoid of any true connection. In the receiving line, they greeted Lord and Lady Pemberton with perfect courtesy. And then Catherine's hand slipped from his arm, and she was absorbed into a group of ladies near the windows, leaving Alexander to navigate the masculine sphere of politics and port. He had been engaged in a discussion of the Reform Bill with several members of Parliament for perhaps 20 minutes when he became aware of a disturbance in the room, a subtle shift in attention, in energy, that made several gentlemen turn toward the entrance. "Ah," said Lord Berkeley, following the collective gaze. "Ashworth has arrived. Back from India at last, I see." Alexander turned and saw a tall figure entering the ballroom with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being watched. Captain James Ashworth, younger son of the Earl of Rothmore recently, returned from military service in the East, moved through the crowd with a smile and a word for everyone, his uniform crisp and decorated with medals that spoke of valor in distant campaigns. "He was quite the favorite before he left," Berkeley continued conversationally. "Half the ladies in London were in love with him. I wonder if his affections are still unattached." Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched Ashworth's progress through the ballroom. The captain moved, with purpose, greeting acquaintances but clearly searching for someone, and when his gaze found Catherine standing near the windows, his entire expression transformed into something warm and delighted. "Ashworth was quite taken with your wife, I recall," Berkeley remarked, apparently oblivious to the effect of his words. "Before your marriage, of course. I believe he nearly proposed to her himself. But then the military summons came and he had to leave for India. And by the time he returned to England, she was already betrothed to you. Pity that. They would have made a handsome couple. Alexander said nothing, could say nothing, as he watched James Ashworth approach Catherine, saw the way her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine pleasure as she recognized him, saw her extend her hand and watched Ashworth bring it to his lips with a familiarity that spoke of prior acquaintance. "If you'll excuse me," Alexander said abruptly, moving away from Berkeley before the man could respond. He navigated the crowd with barely controlled urgency, telling himself he was being ridiculous, that Catherine was simply greeting an old acquaintance, that nothing in her behavior was improper. But the rational part of his mind was overwhelmed by something more primitive, more visceral, a terrible recognition that another man was looking at his wife with undisguised affection and that she was smiling at him with more warmth than she had shown Alexander in months. By the time he reached Catherine's side, Ashworth had been joined by several other ladies, and Catherine was laughing at something he had said, her face animated in a way Alexander had not seen since the early days of their marriage. "Your Grace," Catherine said, noticing his approach, her smile dimming slightly. "Allow me to present Captain James Ashworth, recently returned from India. Captain, my husband, the Duke of Ashford." Ashworth turned to Alexander with a respectful bow, but there was something in his eyes, measuring quality perhaps, or a hint of challenge. "Your Grace, it is an honor to make your acquaintance. I knew Her Grace slightly before her marriage, during her first season in London." "Indeed," Alexander said, his voice cooler than he intended. "My wife has many acquaintances from that period, though none, I think, who hold her in higher regard than I do," Ashworth replied smoothly, his gaze returning to Catherine. "I was quite devastated to return from India and find that the most captivating woman of my acquaintance had married in my absence." Catherine laughed, a soft, musical sound. "You are as charming as ever, Captain. I trust India has not dimmed your considerable talent for flattery." "It is not flattery when it is truth," Ashworth said, and there was something in his tone, something sincere beneath the easy charm, that made Alexander's hands clench at his sides. "The captain is too kind," Catherine said, glancing at Alexander, perhaps sensing his tension. "He forgets that I am now a married woman, and such effusive compliments are no longer appropriate." "On the contrary," Ashworth replied, "marriage does not change truth, merely circumstance. And the truth is that you are even more beautiful than I remembered, which I would not have thought possible." It was too much. Alexander felt something snap inside him, some carefully maintained control fracturing under the weight of watching another man speak to his wife with the warmth and admiration he had systematically denied her. "Captain Ashworth," he said, his voice cold and sharp as winter ice, "I wonder if you are aware that such persistent attention to another man's wife might be considered improper, regardless of your prior acquaintance." The group fell silent. Catherine's eyes widened in shock, and Ashworth's expression shifted from easy charm to something harder, more calculating. "I meant no disrespect, Your Grace," Ashworth said carefully. "I was merely renewing an old friendship." "Then perhaps you should renew your friendships with equal enthusiasm among all your acquaintances," Alexander replied, "rather than focusing your considerable charm so singularly on my wife." "Alexander," Catherine said quietly, a note of warning in her voice. But Alexander was beyond restraint, months of repressed emotion finding an outlet in jealousy he could not contain. "If you will excuse us, Captain, I believe my wife has promised me the next dance." He extended his hand to Catherine, and, after a moment's hesitation, during which her eyes searched his face with something that might have been confusion or anger or both, she placed her hand in his. He led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra began a waltz, his hand settling at her waist. In the first deliberate touch he had initiated in over a year, she was rigid in his arms, her expression carefully neutral. "That was unconscionable," she said quietly, as they began to move. "Captain Ashworth was doing nothing improper." "Was he not?" Alexander replied, his voice low and harsh. "He was making love to you with his words in front of half of London society. He was being polite, friendly, things you might recall from distant memory." The barb struck true, and Alexander's hand tightened fractionally at her waist. "I will not stand by and watch another man court my wife." Catherine looked up at him then, and her eyes were blazing with an emotion he had not seen in her before. Anger, yes, but also something fierce and defiant. Your wife? When have you ever treated me as your wife, Alexander? You keep me at arm's length, refuse any intimacy, create distance at every opportunity, and now you dare to be jealous when another man shows me simple kindness? It was not simple kindness. It was more than you have shown me in 18 months, Catherine interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper, but vibrating with intensity. Captain Ashworth made me feel, for 5 minutes, like a woman worthy of admiration, like someone desirable, like more than a duty to be fulfilled and then forgotten. The words struck Alexander like physical blows. Catherine, you gave up any right to jealousy when you chose to treat me like a stranger, she continued, tears now visible in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. You cannot have it both ways, Alexander. You cannot keep me at a distance and then be angry when that distance allows room for others to step closer. The music swirled around them, other couples, moving in elegant patterns, but Alexander felt as though they were alone in the ballroom, trapped in this moment of terrible honesty. I did not realize, he began, but Catherine shook her head. No, you did not realize, because you have been so consumed with protecting yourself from feeling anything that you never stopped to consider what I might be feeling, what it might be like to be married to a man who treats you with less warmth than he shows his servants. The dance ended, and Catherine extracted herself from his arms with practiced grace, curtsying perfectly before turning away. I need some air, she said, her voice now carefully controlled. Please do not follow me. She disappeared into the crowd, moving toward the terrace, and Alexander stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, watching her go, feeling something crumble inside his chest. Lord Berkeley appeared at his elbow. Trouble in paradise, Ashford. Alexander turned to him with such a look that Berkeley actually stepped back, hands raised in apology. Forgive me, I meant no offense. But Alexander barely heard him. His eyes were tracking Catherine's progress through the crowd, watching as she stepped out onto the terrace into the night air. And a moment later, he saw James Ashworth follow her. Rational thought fled. Alexander moved toward the terrace with single-minded purpose, ignoring greetings and attempts at conversation, his entire being focused on reaching Catherine before what? Before Ashworth could speak to her? Before she could smile at him again with that warmth she no longer showed her husband? Before Alexander lost her entirely to his own stupidity? He reached the terrace to find Catherine standing at the balustrade, looking out over the Pemberton Gardens, and Ashworth standing several feet away, maintaining a respectful distance but speaking to her in low, earnest tones. Never stopped thinking of you, Ashworth was saying. Those years in India, through all the Dior campaigns and the heat and the loneliness, it was your face I remembered, your laugh, the way you quoted poetry and looked at the world with such joy. Please, Captain, Catherine said, her voice tired, do not say these things. Why not? Ashworth asked, stepping closer. You are not happy, Catherine. Anyone with eyes can see it, and I could make you happy. I know I could. If you would just... That is quite enough, Alexander said, stepping out onto the terrace. Both Catherine and Ashworth turned to face him. Catherine's expression was weary, while Ashworth's was defiant. Your Grace, Ashworth said, not backing down. I heard what you were doing, Alexander interrupted, moving to stand beside Catherine in a gesture of possession he knew was years too late. And I will ask you once politely to leave my wife alone. Or what? Ashworth challenged, his military bearing evident in the way he held himself. You will call me out? Create a scandal? Over what? Speaking kindly to a woman whose husband treats her like an inconvenience? Captain Ashworth, Catherine interjected, placing a hand on Alexander's arm, a gesture that startled him with its protectiveness. Please, this is not helping. I apologize, Catherine, Ashworth said, his expression softening as he looked at her. But I cannot stand by and watch you suffer in a marriage that brings you no joy. You deserve so much more than this cold arrangement. What I deserve is not your concern, Catherine said firmly. I made my choice 3 years ago and I will stand by it, whatever difficulties it may entail. Even if that choice is destroying you, Ashworth pressed. That is my burden to bear, Catherine replied, not yours. And I must ask you, as a gentleman, and as someone who claims to care for my welfare, to respect the vows I have made and the position I hold. I am the Duchess of Ashford. Whatever your feelings or mine may be, that fact cannot change." Ashworth stood silent for a long moment, and Alexander saw the man's jaw clench with frustration, but finally he bowed, to Catherine, not to Alexander. "As you wish," he said quietly, "but know that if you ever need anything at all, you need only send word, and I will come. That is a promise I make to you now, and one I will keep until my dying day." Then he turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving Alexander and Catherine alone on the terrace, with the music and laughter of the ball filtering out through the windows like sounds from another world. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Catherine remained at the balustrade, her hand still resting on Alexander's arm, though he suspected she was barely aware of it. Alexander could feel the tremor in her fingers, the emotion she was struggling to contain. "Did you love him?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Before you married me, were you in love with Captain Ashworth?" Catherine drew a breath, and when she answered, her voice was very quiet. "I found him charming. I enjoyed his company. When he left for India, I was disappointed. But no, I did not love him. I barely knew him. And now?" She turned to look at him then, and in her eyes was a devastation that made Alexander want to fall to his knees. "Now I am married to you. Whatever feelings I may or may not have are irrelevant." "That is not an answer." "It is the only answer I can give you," Catherine said, withdrawing her hand from his arm. "Because the truth is more complicated than a simple yes or no, and I am too tired to navigate those complications tonight." She moved toward the door, but Alexander stepped into her path, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders, the most contact they had shared in months, perhaps in over a year. "Catherine, please, help me understand what is happening. Help me understand what I am losing." She looked up at him, and tears were sliding down her cheeks now, though her voice remained steady. "You are losing nothing you ever valued, Alexander. That is the tragedy of this situation. I am the one losing. I am the one who has been losing piece by piece, day by day, for almost 2 years now. And tonight I discovered that it is possible for a man to look at me with admiration, with desire, with genuine affection. Captain Ashworth reminded me of what I have been missing, what I gave up when I married a man who can barely bring himself to touch me. I am touching you now," Alexander said, his hands tightening on her shoulders. "Out of jealousy," Catherine replied. "Out of possession and fear of losing what you consider yours, but not out of love, Alexander. Never out of love. And that is what breaks my heart, beyond all mending." She pulled away from him then, and this time he let her go, watching as she disappeared back into the ballroom, leaving him alone on the terrace with the night air and the terrible understanding that she was right. He had touched her out of jealousy, out of the sudden fierce need to stake his claim in the face of another man's interest. But he had not touched her out of love, because he had spent 3 years denying himself that emotion, convinced it was weakness, when in truth it was the only thing that might have saved them both. Alexander stood there for a long time, listening to the music from the ballroom, to the sound of laughter and conversation, to the night birds in the Pemberton Gardens, and slowly, with the inexorable certainty of dawn, following darkness, he understood that he had reached a crossroads. He could continue as he had been, maintaining his careful distance, protecting himself from the vulnerability of love. But that path led only to watching Catherine slip further away, to seeing her find comfort in the attention of other men, because her own husband was too afraid to give her what she needed. Or he could choose differently. He could face the terror that had paralyzed him for 3 years. He could risk the possibility of pain for the chance, however slim it might now be, of something real. The ghost of his brother whispered in his mind, Richard's voice from those terrible final months. "I would not trade a single day with her, Alex, not even knowing how it ends. The love was worth the loss. It will always be worth the loss." At the time, Alexander had thought his brother was mad with grief, speaking nonsense in his suffering. But now, standing alone on the Pemberton terrace with his marriage crumbling, around him Alexander wondered if perhaps Richard had understood something essential that he himself had missed. Perhaps the real tragedy was not in loving and losing, but in refusing to love at all. Perhaps the real cowardice was not in surrendering to emotion, but in hiding from it. Perhaps Alexander Thornfield, 7th Duke of Ashford, had been wrong about everything that mattered. And perhaps, though this thought terrified him most of all, it was not yet too late to change. But even as hope flickered tentatively to life in his chest, even as he considered the possibility of transformation, Alexander heard again Catherine's words. "You are losing nothing you ever valued." The question that haunted him as he finally returned to the ballroom, as he watched Catherine dance with Lord Pemberton and then with several other gentlemen, always graceful, always perfectly correct, always surrounded by admirers, was whether she would ever believe that he had come to value her. Whether there was any apology powerful enough, any demonstration sincere enough, to convince her that he had finally understood what he stood to lose. Whether a man could change so fundamentally, so completely, that he became worthy of a woman he had spent 3 years pushing away. And whether that woman, bruised and disappointed by years of rejection, would have any reason to believe in that change, or to give him the chance to prove it. The carriage ride back to Ashford House was conducted in absolute silence. Catherine sat on one side, Alexander on the other, the space between them filled with everything that had been said and everything that remained unspoken. The lamplight from passing streets flickered across her face, revealing nothing. She had perfected the art of aristocratic composure, and she wielded it now like armor. When they arrived home, Catherine ascended the stairs to her apartments without a word, without a glance back. Alexander stood in the entrance hall, listening to her footsteps fade, listening to her door close with a soft, final click that seemed to reverberate through the empty house. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he paced his chambers like a caged animal, wrestling with thoughts that refused to organize themselves into coherence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Catherine's face on the terrace, the tears, the resignation, the terrible weariness of a woman who had fought for something and finally surrendered. "You are losing nothing you ever valued." The words circled in his mind like carrion birds, picking at the remains of his carefully constructed philosophy. Because she was wrong, or rather, she had been right for so long, that his recent realization of her worth had come too late to matter. He had valued her. He had simply been too afraid to admit it, too committed to his strategy of emotional distance to acknowledge what she had come to mean to him. And now, Captain James Ashworth, a man with an honest heart, and no fear of showing it, stood, ready to give Catherine everything Alexander had denied her. Morning came grey and cold, though it was technically spring. Alexander descended to breakfast to find Catherine already there, composed and distant, reading correspondence as she took her tea. She acknowledged his entrance with a slight nod but did not speak, and Alexander found himself uncertain how to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. "Catherine," he began, taking his seat, "about last evening. There is no need to discuss it," she interrupted, her voice perfectly modulated, perfectly polite. "We both said things in the heat of the moment. I propose we consider the matter closed." "I do not wish to consider it closed," Alexander said. "I wish to speak about what Captain Ashworth said to you, about what you said to me." Catherine set down her teacup with deliberate precision. "What purpose would that serve, Your Grace? We have established the nature of our marriage. Further discussion will only cause additional pain." "Perhaps some pain is necessary," Alexander said, surprised by his own words. "Perhaps we have been avoiding necessary conversations for far too long." Catherine looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw exhaustion in her eyes. Not the physical tiredness of a poor night's sleep, but the soul-deep weariness of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for years. "I cannot do this anymore," she said quietly. "I cannot continue to have hope that you will change, only to have that hope extinguished again and again. It is destroying me, Alexander. Can you not see that?" "I can see it," he admitted. "And Catherine, I want to try. I want to be the husband you deserve." "You wanted to be that husband in the garden 3 days ago when you explained about your brother," Catherine said. "And yet here we are, nothing changed except that you have now added jealousy to the list of emotions you allow yourself to feel regarding me. Jealousy, but not affection. Possession, but not love. That is not fair." "Is it not?" Catherine challenged. and now there was steel in her voice, a strength he had not heard before. "Tell me, Alexander, if Captain Ashworth had not appeared, if he had not shown me kindness and admiration, would you be here now claiming you want to try? Or would you still be safely behind your walls, content to maintain our polite, cold arrangement indefinitely?" Alexander opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, because the truth was complicated and damning. Ashworth's appearance had been a catalyst, yes, but the feelings Ashworth had awakened in Alexander, the jealousy, the fear of loss, had been building for months, for years, beneath the surface of his careful control. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps I needed to see you through another man's eyes to understand what I was refusing to see myself." "And that is supposed to comfort me?" Catherine asked, standing from the table. "That you only value me when you perceive a threat to your possession of me? That it took another man's interest to make you consider treating me as a wife rather than an obligation?" "Catherine, please, no," she said firmly. "I will not do this. I will not allow you to decide in a moment of jealous panic that you suddenly wish to change the terms of our marriage, because in a week or a month, when Captain Ashworth has left London and the threat has passed, you will retreat again. You will return to your study and your careful distance, and I will be left even more broken than I am now. I give you my word." "Your word?" Catherine laughed, a bitter sound. "You gave me your word 3 years ago, Alexander. You stood before God and promised to love and cherish me. How has that word been honored?" The accusation hung in the air between them, unanswerable because it was true. Alexander had made vows, and he had kept only those that required nothing of his heart. "I was wrong," he said, the admission difficult but necessary. "I have been wrong about everything, but Catherine, I am trying." "Try with someone else," Catherine said, moving toward the door. "I am finished being the object of your attempts at reformation. I am finished hoping that you will become the man I need. I am simply finished." She left the breakfast room, and Alexander sat frozen, staring at the place where she had been, feeling something crack open inside him, not the careful crack of the previous days, but a complete fracture, a breaking that went to the core of who he was. She was finished. She had given up, and he had no one to blame but himself. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Catherine withdrew completely, spending her time paying calls to friends, attending charitable meetings, occupying herself with every possible activity that kept her away from Ashford House. When they were forced to appear together at social engagements, she was perfectly correct, perfectly composed and utterly unreachable, and Captain Ashworth was everywhere. At the theatre, Alexander looked up from his box to see Ashworth in Lady Rothmore's box, his eyes fixed not on the stage, but on Catherine. At Lady Devonshire's dinner party, Ashworth managed to be seated near enough to Catherine to engage her in conversation throughout the meal. At the promenade in Hyde Park, Ashworth appeared on horseback, dismounting to walk beside Catherine's carriage and speak with her through the window. Each encounter was perfectly proper. Ashworth never overstepped the bounds of propriety, never said or did anything that could be criticized, but his attention was constant, his admiration obvious, and Catherine, though she maintained appropriate distance, did not discourage him. Alexander watched it all with a growing sense of desperation. He wanted to forbid her from speaking to Ashworth, to order her to refuse his attentions, to exert his rights as her husband and command her to obedience. But he knew with bitter certainty that such commands would only drive her further away. He had forfeited the right to her willing affection. He could not now claim the privilege of her forced compliance. So he watched, and he suffered. And slowly, painfully, he began to understand what Richard had felt, the helpless agony of watching something precious slip away, the desperate need to hold on, while knowing that very desperation might push it further out of reach. The breaking point came at the Rothmore musical, 2 weeks after the Pemberton Ball. The evening was meant to be a showcase for Lady Rothmore's considerable musical talents, with various guests performing for the assembled company. Catherine had been prevailed upon to play, and she sat at the pianoforte in a gown of deep burgundy, her fingers moving over the keys with the same emotional depth she had always brought to her music. She chose Beethoven, the Pathétique Sonata, a piece of profound melancholy and yearning. And as she played, Alexander watched her face and saw in it everything she could not say. The pain, the loneliness, the slow death of hope. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, but Alexander barely heard it, barely registered the other guests' appreciation. All he could see was Catherine's face, the careful mask slipping for just a moment to reveal the devastation beneath. And then Captain Ashworth was there, approaching Catherine as she rose from the pianoforte, speaking to her in low tones that made her smile. A small, sad smile, but a smile nonetheless. Alexander stood abruptly, ignoring the startled looks from those around him, and crossed the room with purpose. He reached Catherine's side, just as Ashworth was saying something about the beauty of her playing, about how music revealed the soul of the performer. "Catherine," Alexander said, his voice rough, "I need to speak with you. Privately." Catherine looked at him with surprise and perhaps a hint of alarm. "Your Grace, we are in the middle of a social engagement." "Now," Alexander interrupted, knowing he was being improper, knowing he was creating exactly the sort of scene he had spent his life avoiding, and finding he did not care. "Please." Something in his expression must have convinced her, because after a moment's hesitation, she excused herself to Ashworth and followed Alexander out of the music room, down a corridor, into an empty library where moonlight streamed through tall windows. "What is the meaning of this?" Catherine demanded, her composure fraying. "You cannot simply drag me away from a social event. I cannot do this anymore," Alexander said, the words tumbling out without plan or polish. "I cannot watch you smile at him. I cannot watch you give him the warmth you once showed me. I cannot stand here and pretend that my heart is not breaking, Catherine, because it is. It is breaking, and I do not know how to stop it." Catherine stared at him, her eyes wide. "Your heart. You have spent 3 years convincing me you do not possess such an organ, and now you claim it is breaking?" "Because it is," Alexander said, moving closer to her, his hands reaching for hers though she pulled away. "Because I have been a fool, Catherine. I have been a coward. I have hidden behind my brother's tragedy and my own fear, and in doing so, I have created the very loss I was trying to avoid." "Alexander—" "No, please, let me finish," he interrupted, his voice desperate now. "I know I have no right to ask this of you. I know I have hurt you beyond what words can repair. But I am asking anyway, begging if necessary. Give me another chance. Give me the opportunity to be the husband I should have been from the beginning." "Why?" Catherine asked, and there were tears in her eyes now. "Why now, Alexander? Because of Captain Ashworth? Because another man has shown interest in what you have discarded?" "Because I am terrified of losing you," Alexander admitted, the words raw and honest. "Because I have watched you withdraw further every day, watched the light dim in your eyes, watched you stop calling me my love, and I have finally understood that I am losing the most precious thing I have ever possessed." "You never wanted to possess it," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "You never wanted me, not really. You wanted a duchess, a hostess, a figurehead, but you never wanted Catherine, the woman who loved you, who waited for you, who hoped every day that you might finally see her." "I see you now," Alexander said, and his own eyes were burning with tears he had not shed since Richard's funeral. "God help me, Catherine. I see you now, and I am terrified that I have realized it too late." Catherine stood very still, tears sliding down her cheeks, her hands clasped before her as though to keep them from trembling. "What you feel is not love, Alexander. It is fear of loss, which is not the same thing. You do not love me. You are simply afraid of being alone. Again, afraid of watching someone else slip away as your brother did." "You are wrong," Alexander said, and now he did close the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face, forcing her to look at him. "I have been falling in love with you since the day I married you, Catherine. I have simply been too much a coward to admit it, too afraid to allow myself to feel what I could no longer deny. If you loved me, you would have touched me," Catherine whispered. "You would have come to me in the night. You would have held me when I wept, kissed me when I smiled. You would have been my husband in more than name." "I know," Alexander said, his thumbs brushing away her tears even as his own fell unchecked. "I know, and I have no excuse that will satisfy you. I can only tell you that I was afraid of needing you, afraid of the power you would have over me if I allowed myself to love you completely, and that fear has cost me everything." Catherine closed her eyes, fresh, tears escaping. "It is too late, Alexander. Too much has been broken. I do not have the strength to rebuild what you have spent 3 years destroying." "Then do not rebuild it," Alexander said desperately. Let me be the one to fight for this marriage, to prove that I have changed. I know I have no right to ask." "No, you do not," Catherine interrupted, pulling away from him, putting distance between them once more. "You do not have the right to decide, in a moment of panic, that you suddenly wish to change everything. You do not have the right to ask me to open my heart again, when you have proven repeatedly that you will only hurt me." "Catherine, please, I need time," she said, her voice firm despite the tears. "I need time away from you, away from London, away from all of this. I'm going to my sister's in Hertfordshire tomorrow, and I am going alone." "No," Alexander said, the word torn from him. "Catherine, if you leave now, if I stay, I will lose myself entirely." Catherine said, and now her voice was steady, resolved. "I will lose what little remains of my self-respect, of my dignity. I need distance, Alexander. I need to think clearly, without your presence confusing everything." "And if I follow you?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. "If you follow me, I will refuse to see you," Catherine said. "I mean this, Alexander. I need you to respect this one request, to give me this one thing. Let me go. Let me have space to breathe, to decide what I want from what remains of my life." "And Ashworth?" Alexander asked, the question bitter on his tongue. Catherine met his eyes, and in hers was a complex mixture of pain and anger, and something that might have been pity. "Captain Ashworth is not your concern. My friendship with him, whatever form it may take, is not your concern. You gave up the right to dictate my friendships when you chose to be a husband in name only. He wants more than friendship," Alexander said. "He wants you, Catherine. He has made that abundantly clear." "And perhaps I want someone who wants me," Catherine replied, the words deliberate and cutting. "Perhaps I am tired of being married to a man who treats me like an inconvenience. Perhaps Captain Ashworth's honest affection is preferable to your jealous possession." The words struck Alexander like physical blows, and he actually staggered back a step. "You would leave me for him?" "I do not know what I will do," Catherine said wearily. "That is why I need time to think, to feel, to decide what I can bear and what I cannot. But I do know that I cannot continue as we have been. Something must change, Alexander. Either you must truly change in ways that last beyond this moment of crisis, or I must accept that our marriage is a failure and determine how to proceed from that truth." She moved toward the door, and this time Alexander did not try to stop her, knowing that to do so would only prove what she had already accused him of, that his desire to keep her was about possession, not love. "Catherine," he said as her hand reached for the door handle. She paused but did not turn around. "I do love you," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "I know you do not believe it. I know I have given you no reason to believe it. But it is true, and I will spend whatever time it takes, months, years, the rest of my life, proving it to you, if you will only give me the chance." Catherine stood silent for a long moment, her back still to him, her hand on the door. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost could not hear it. "That is what I am afraid of, Alexander, that you do love me, or could love me, but that your love comes too late, that the damage is too deep to heal, the trust too shattered to rebuild, and that we will both spend the rest of our lives mourning what might have been had you been brave enough to love me when it mattered." Then she opened the door and was gone, leaving Alexander alone. In the moonlit library, with the echo of her words and the ruins of his carefully constructed life, he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. And for the first time since Richard's funeral, Alexander Thornfield wept. Great, wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame. He wept for his brother, for Richard's lost love and wasted suffering. He wept for Catherine, for the pain he had caused her through his cowardice and pride. And he wept for himself, for the man he might have been if he had not been so afraid, for the marriage he might have had if he had been brave enough to fight for it before it was too late. And in the darkness of that library, surrounded by books filled with stories of love and loss, of tragedy and redemption, Alexander finally understood the full weight of what he had done. He had taken a woman who loved him freely and turned her love into suffering. He had taken a marriage that could have been beautiful and made it a prison. He had been given a gift and had thrown it away out of fear. And now perhaps he would pay the price his brother had paid, not through the death of a beloved, but through the loss of one who lived and breathed and walked in the world, but would no longer walk beside him. The irony was so profound it nearly broke him. In trying to avoid Richard's fate, he had created his own version of that tragedy. Different in details, but identical in essence. A man destroyed by love, whether by feeling it too deeply or refusing to feel it at all. Outside the library window, London continued its glittering evening, music and laughter drifting from the Rothmore house. But Alexander heard none of it, saw none of it. He sat in the darkness and faced, finally, the truth he had been running from for 3 years. He loved Catherine, desperately, completely, with a depth that terrified him precisely because it was so absolute, and he might have realized it too late to matter. Catherine departed for Hertfordshire at dawn, as she had promised. Alexander stood at his study window and watched her carriage pull away from Ashford House, watched it turn the corner and disappear from view, and felt something inside him go numb with the finality of it. She had not said goodbye, had not in fact acknowledged his existence at all that morning. He had heard her moving through the house in the pre-dawn darkness, had heard the servants loading her trunks, had stood frozen in his chambers, wanting desperately to go to her but honoring her request for distance. Now she was gone, and Ashford House felt like a tomb. Alexander did not go to Parliament that day. He sent word that he was indisposed, a diplomatic illness that would be understood as code for personal matters best left unexamined. Instead, he remained in his study, staring at nothing, replaying every conversation, every moment, every opportunity he had squandered over the past 3 years. His secretary brought correspondence that required attention. Alexander looked at the papers without seeing them, signed documents without reading them. None of it mattered. The business of being a duke, the responsibilities he had always placed above everything else, they all seemed suddenly hollow, meaningless. What did it profit a man to manage estates and influence legislation if he came home each evening to emptiness? What was the point of a title and a fortune if the one person whose presence made it all bearable had been driven away by his own folly? The first letter from Catherine arrived 3 days after her departure. Alexander's hands shook as he opened it, hoping for what? Forgiveness? A declaration that she had reconsidered? Permission to follow her to Hertfordshire? The letter contained none of these things. Your Grace, I write to inform you of my safe arrival at my sister's home. Margaret and her family are well and have graciously agreed to host me for an extended visit. I trust the household in London is managing adequately in my absence. Please, convey my regards to the staff and inform them that I shall send instructions regarding the summer preparations for Ashford when I have had time to consider the matter. I remain, Catherine, Duchess of Ashford. The formality of it was like a knife to the heart. No warmth, no personal details, no hint of the woman he had held in his arms in the library 2 weeks ago. Just cold courtesy, the minimum required of a duchess to her duke. Alexander read the letter 3 times, searching for some hidden, meaning some sign that beneath the formal words lay the woman he loved. But there was nothing. She had perfected the art he had taught her, emotional distance expressed through flawless propriety. He sat down to write a response, then found himself staring at blank paper, uncertain what to say. Come home? She would refuse. I love you? She had heard those words and had not believed them. I am sorry. Apologies felt inadequate for the magnitude of his failures. In the end, he wrote only, Catherine, I'm glad you arrived safely. The household misses your presence, as do I. Whatever time you need, whatever space will help you heal, I will give it. But know that you are thought of every moment of every day, and that my feelings have not changed despite your absence. Yours, Alexander. He sent the letter knowing it was insufficient, knowing words on paper could not undo years of neglect. But it was all he had, this inadequate offering of ink and sentiment, sent across the miles to a woman who had every reason to consign it to the fire unread. London became unbearable. Everywhere Alexander went, he was reminded of Catherine, the theatre where she had laughed at a comedy, the park where she had walked in the mornings. the shops where she had purchased ribbons and books, and worse, everywhere he went, he encountered Captain James Ashworth. At White's, his gentleman's club, Alexander looked up from a brandy to find Ashworth entering the room. Their eyes met across the space, and something passed between them, a recognition perhaps that they were rivals for the same prize, and that Alexander was currently losing. Ashworth approached with the confident stride of a military man. "Your Grace, I trust you are well?" "Tolerably," Alexander replied, his voice cold. "And the Duchess? I have not seen her in society recently." "My wife is visiting her family in Hertfordshire," Alexander said, each word carefully controlled. "Ah," Ashworth said, and there was something in his expression, satisfaction perhaps, or calculation. "I hope she is finding the country air restorative. London can be rather stifling." "What do you want, Ashworth?" Alexander asked bluntly, abandoning pretense. Ashworth sat down across from him without invitation, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I want you to understand something, Your Grace. I am not your enemy. I have no desire to create scandal or to damage your reputation." "How magnanimous," Alexander said bitterly. "But," Ashworth continued, ignoring the sarcasm, "I love her. I have loved her since I first met her 5 years ago, before she ever knew you existed. And I believe, no, I know, that I could make her happy in ways you have proven unwilling or unable to do." "You know nothing of my marriage," Alexander said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I know what I see," Ashworth replied. "I see a woman who flinches when you touch her. I see a woman who no longer smiles in your presence. I see a woman who looks at you with the kind of sadness that comes from hope repeatedly denied." "And you think you can repair that damage?" Alexander challenged. "I think I would never have caused it in the first place," Ashworth said. "I think I would have cherished her from the first day, rather than spending years treating her like an obligation. I think I would have made our marriage a partnership of affection rather than a prison of duty." Alexander's hands clenched on his glass, but he forced himself to remain calm. "If you believe Catherine would welcome an affair, you understand her even less than you claim I do. She is a woman of honor and principle. She would never betray her vows, regardless of her feelings." "I have no intention of asking her to betray her vows," Ashworth said. "But neither am I going to simply disappear because you have suddenly decided, after 3 years of neglect, that you cannot bear to lose her. What then do you intend?" Ashworth leaned forward, his expression serious. "I intend to to be her friend if she will allow it, to provide the support and admiration you have withheld. And if, when, she decides that she can no longer remain in a marriage that brings her only pain, I intend to be there, ready to offer her the life she deserves." "You speak of divorce," Alexander said, his voice hollow. "You would make her subject to that scandal?" "I would make her happy," Ashworth corrected. "And if the price of her happiness is scandal, then I would bear that price gladly. The question, Your Grace, is whether you love her enough to do the same. Whether you love her enough to let her go if holding on means continuing her suffering." It was the same question Catherine had posed in different words, and Alexander had no better answer now than he had then. Did he love her enough to release her? Could he bear to watch her find happiness with another man, knowing he had driven her to it? "You presume too much," Alexander said finally. "Catherine is my wife. That is a bond, not easily broken regardless of your romantic notions. Then I hope for her sake that you prove worthy of that bond," Ashworth said, standing. "Because if you do not, if you continue to treat her with the coldness that has characterized your marriage thus far, then I will do everything in my power to free her from it." He walked away, leaving Alexander alone with his brandy and his thoughts, and the terrible understanding that Ashworth was not wrong. If Alexander could not change, could not become the husband Catherine needed, then perhaps the greatest act of love he could offer her would be to let her go. But the thought of it, of Catherine in Ashworth's arms, bearing Ashworth's children, building a life with another man, was so unbearable that Alexander felt physically ill. The weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness. Alexander remained in London only because leaving would be to abandon his duties entirely, and even in his misery, he could not bring himself to do that. He attended Parliament, voted on legislation, fulfilled his social obligations with mechanical precision, but inside he was dying by degrees. Catherine's letters came weekly, each one as formal and distant as the first. She wrote of life in Hertfordshire, of her sister's children, of spring flowers and countryside tranquility. She asked after the London household, requested information about estate matters, maintained all the proper communications of a duchess to her duke, but she never wrote anything personal, never mentioned their argument, their situation, their future. It was as though she had simply decided to proceed as though they were business partners with a professional relationship, nothing more. Alexander's responses grew more desperate, despite his attempts at control. He wrote of missing her. He wrote of the house feeling empty without her presence. He wrote, finally, a long letter in which he attempted to explain everything: his fear, his love, his desperate desire for a chance to prove himself. Catherine's response was brief. Your Grace, I have received your recent correspondence. I appreciate the effort it must have required to write so candidly. However, I must be honest. I do not yet know what I feel or what I want, beyond the space I requested. I ask that you give me additional time to sort through my thoughts and feelings without pressure to respond or return. Catherine. The message was clear. His declarations were premature. His feelings, however genuine, were not enough to undo the years of hurt he had inflicted. And so Alexander waited and suffered, and slowly in the isolation of his grief began to change in ways he had not thought possible. He went to Richard's grave for the first time in 2 years. The cemetery was quiet, the grass overgrown around the dual headstones where Richard and Eloise lay side by side. Alexander stood before them for a long time, hands clasped behind his back, trying to find words for a conversation with the dead. I have made a terrible mistake, he said finally, his voice rough. I thought I learned from your tragedy, Richard. I thought I understood the lesson your life was meant to teach me, but I was wrong. The wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the scent of spring earth and growing things. You loved completely and you lost everything, Alexander continued, and I thought the answer was never to love at all, never to give another person that power over my happiness. I thought I was being wise, protecting myself and those around me, but I was just a coward, Richard. I was so afraid of feeling what you felt that I refused to feel anything at all. He knelt, his hand resting on the cold marble of his brother's headstone. And now I am losing Catherine, not to death but to my own stupidity, and I finally understand what you tried to tell me in those last months, that the love was worth the loss, that to have known Eloise, to have loved her, was better than never having risked that. Vulnerability. Tears ran down his face unchecked. I wish you were here, Alexander whispered. I wish I could ask your advice, beg your forgiveness for misunderstanding everything you tried to teach me. You were not weak for loving Eloise. You were the bravest man I ever knew, and I have been the coward all along. He remained there for a long time, kneeling before his brother's grave, and when he finally rose, something had shifted inside him. The ghost he had been carrying, the specter of Richard's tragedy that had haunted every decision for 3 years, it finally began to quiet, because he understood at last that Richard would have hated what Alexander had become, would have been horrified to learn that his younger brother had used his suffering as an excuse for emotional cowardice. Richard had loved Eloise with everything he possessed, and when he lost her, the grief had destroyed him. But those years with her, the joy, the partnership, the deep connection they had shared, had been real and precious, and worth every moment of the pain that followed. Alexander had none of those memories to sustain him. He had only years of careful distance, of opportunities refused, of a woman's slow death of hope. And if he lost Catherine now, when he had finally understood what she meant to him, he would have nothing. No joy to remember, no love to mourn. Only the wasteland of his own fear and the bitter knowledge that he had destroyed the best thing in his life before ever allowing himself to fully possess it. Rain began to fall as Alexander walked through the London streets, not bothering to summon his carriage. He was soaked through by the time he reached Ashford House, water streaming from his coat, his hair plastered to his head. The butler looked alarmed, but Alexander waved him away, climbing the stairs to his chambers, where he stood before the window, staring out at the grey city. And then, with sudden clarity, he knew what he had to do. He had been waiting for Catherine to return, hoping that distance would make her heart grow fonder, that time would heal what he had broken. But that was the old Alexander, passive, cautious, afraid of action that might lead to rejection. The new Alexander, the man he was becoming, understood that he had to fight, had to prove through actions, not words, that he had changed, had to demonstrate his love in ways that could not be dismissed as panic or temporary reformation. But he also had to respect what Catherine had asked for. She needed space, time, freedom from his presence and pressure. So he would give her those things, but he would not give her silence. He would not give her the impression that his feelings were temporary, that his love would fade with absence. He would write to her, not demanding responses, not pressuring her to return, but writing honestly, openly, about everything he should have said years ago, about his feelings, his regrets, his hopes, about who he had been and who he was becoming. He would court her through letters, as he should have courted her in person from the beginning. And if she never responded, if she eventually wrote to say she wanted a separation, or had chosen Ashworth, or simply could not forgive him, well, at least he would know he had fought. At least he would know he had finally been brave enough to be vulnerable, to risk his heart, to love her the way she deserved to be loved. It was terrifying. It went against every instinct he had cultivated for 30 years. But it was also the only path forward that had any chance of redemption. So Alexander sat at his desk, lit a candle against the gathering darkness, and began to write. My dearest Catherine, I know you asked for space, and I'm honoring that request by remaining in London while you are in Hertfordshire. But I hope you will permit me this. Letters in which I tell you all the things I should have said years ago, all the feelings I should have expressed when they first took root in my heart. Today I went to Richard's grave. I have not been there in 2 years, have avoided it because I convinced myself that remembering my brother's tragedy would strengthen my resolve to avoid his fate. But standing there today, I finally understood what a fool I have been. Richard loved deeply and he lost everything. But those years with Eloise were not wasted. They were the best years of his life, and if he could have chosen, knowing how it would end, I believe he would have chosen exactly the same path. Because the love was real, Catherine, the joy was real, and that made the pain worth bearing. I have had no such joy with you, and that is entirely my fault. I have kept you at a distance, denied us both the happiness we might have shared, all out of fear, and now I face the very loss I was trying to avoid, but without any beautiful memories to sustain me through it. I'm writing to tell you that I love you, not because I am afraid of losing you, though I am, not because another man has shown interest in you, though that forced me to confront truths I was avoiding, but because it is true, has been true for longer than I allowed myself to admit, and will continue to be true regardless of what you decide about our future. I love the way you move through a room, graceful and purposeful. I love the way you play the pianoforte, pouring emotion into music in ways I could never express in words. I love your kindness to the servants, your devotion to the tenants, your quiet strength that I mistook for acquiescence. I love you, Catherine, and whether or not you ever return to me, whether or not you can forgive the years I wasted, I want you to know this truth. You are loved, deeply, completely, irrevocably. I will write again tomorrow and the next day, and for as many days as it takes to convince you that this is not temporary reformation, but permanent transformation, that the man who hurt you is learning finally to be the man who deserves you. Yours always, Alexander. He sealed the letter and sent it that evening before he could reconsider, and then he returned to his desk and began another, knowing that words alone would never be enough, but hoping that perhaps, if he was honest enough, vulnerable enough, persistent enough, she might begin to believe that his change was real, that his love was worth a second chance, that what they had destroyed together might somehow be rebuilt. Outside his window, the rain continued to fall on London, washing the streets clean, and Alexander wrote into the night, pouring his heart onto paper in a way he had never allowed himself to do in person. It was terrifying, it was necessary, and it was perhaps already too late, but he had to try. The letters went out daily, each one sealed with Alexander's personal crest, each one carried by special courier to ensure they reached Catherine in Hertfordshire without delay. Alexander wrote them late at night, when the house was silent and there was nothing to distract him from the raw honesty he was attempting to capture on paper. He wrote about his childhood, about growing up in Richard's shadow and learning to retreat into reserve as a form of self-protection. He wrote about his father's death, about assuming responsibilities too young, and building walls to protect himself from vulnerability. He wrote about watching Richard and Eloise fall in love, about the mixture of joy and fear he had felt witnessing such complete devotion. He wrote about the day he met Catherine, about how her smile had struck him with unexpected force, about how he had almost walked away from the introduction because something in her eyes had warned him she could be dangerous to his carefully maintained control. He wrote about their courtship, brief and formal, and how he had convinced himself that his attraction to her was manageable, containable. About their wedding day, when she had looked at him with such hope, and he had felt the first real tremor of fear that perhaps he had miscalculated, that perhaps this woman would not be content with the distant marriage he had planned. He wrote about their wedding night. This letter was the most difficult, the most vulnerable, because it required him to admit truths he had hidden even from himself. He described how he had felt touching her, how her responsiveness had terrified him with its intensity, how he had realized in those intimate hours that she had the power to undo him completely, and how, in the days that followed, he had begun his retreat, carefully constructing distance to protect himself from the depth of feeling she evoked. "I told myself I was being wise," he wrote. "I told myself I was protecting us both from the tragedy that had consumed my brother. But the truth, Catherine, is that I was simply afraid. Afraid of how much I wanted you. Afraid of how much I was beginning to need your presence, your smile, your good opinion. Afraid that if I allowed myself to love you fully, I would lose myself in that love, would become vulnerable in ways I had sworn never to permit. So I withdrew. Deliberately, systematically, I created the cold marriage that has caused you so much pain. And I told myself it was noble, this sacrifice of immediate happiness for long-term protection. I told myself I was being rational, mature, wise. I was none of those things. I was simply a coward." He wrote about specific moments, times when he had wanted to reach for her and had forced himself to remain distant. Mornings when her "good morning, my love" had made his chest ache with longing he refused to acknowledge. Evenings when he had stood outside her door, wanting to go to her, and had instead returned to his cold, solitary chambers. He wrote about the 18 months of complete physical separation, about how that had begun not as a planned strategy, but as a gradual withdrawal that became permanent. About how each day of distance had made the next day easier, until weeks became months, and months became a year, and he had almost convinced himself that the ache in his chest was normal, manageable, bearable. It was not bearable, he wrote. "I was dying, Catherine, as surely as Richard died after losing Eloise. But I was dying by inches, over years, in a tragedy of my own creation. And I did not even realize it until I saw you with Captain Ashworth and understood, finally, what I stood to lose." He wrote about the Pemberton ball, about the jealousy that had consumed him watching another man make her smile, about their confrontation afterward, about her words that had shattered his carefully constructed philosophy, about the days since her departure, about the emptiness of Ashford House without her, about how every room echoed with her absence. "I'm not asking you to return," he wrote in one letter. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, or to believe that I have changed, or even to read these letters if doing so causes you pain. I am simply telling you the truth, Catherine. I am laying my heart bare in a way I should have done 3 years ago, in a way I was too afraid to do then, but I'm too desperate not to do now. I love you. I will always love you. And whether you return to me or choose a life without me, I want you to know that truth. I want you to understand that your worth is not diminished by my failure to recognize it, that you are extraordinary, beloved, deserving of every happiness. If I could go back and change everything, I would. If I could return to our wedding day with the knowledge I have now, I would cherish every moment, would build the marriage we should have had from the beginning. But I cannot change the past. I can only promise that if you give me a future, any future, on any terms you choose, I will spend every day proving that I have learned, that I have changed, that I am finally brave enough to love you the way you deserve." For 3 weeks, Alexander wrote daily. For 3 weeks he received no response beyond Catherine's weekly formal letters about household matters and estate business, letters that never acknowledged his emotional correspondence, never indicated whether she was reading his confessions or consigning them to the fire. The uncertainty was torture, but Alexander continued writing because to stop would be to surrender, and he had finally learned that some things were worth fighting for, even when the battle seemed hopeless. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late May, a different letter arrived. The Maibur handwriting was Catherine's, but the envelope was thicker than usual, and his name was written simply as Alexander, not Your Grace or the Duke of Ashford. His hands trembled as he opened it. Alexander, I have read every letter. Some I have read multiple times, trying to understand whether the words represent genuine change or the temporary passion of a man facing loss. I have shared portions of your letters with my sister, omitting the more private details, and asked her opinion. I have prayed. I have walked in the gardens here and tried to imagine what our future might look like, together or apart. And I have reached a decision. I will return to London next week, but I am not returning as your wife, not yet. I am returning to see if the man who wrote these letters truly exists, or if he is merely a fantasy conjured by desperation and jealousy. I will stay at Ashford House, but in separate apartments. We will spend time together, taking meals, walking, conversing, but I make no promises about the future of our marriage. I am giving you an opportunity to prove, through actions rather than words, that you have changed. But I am also protecting my heart, which has been broken too many times to be carelessly offered again. I need you to understand something, Alexander. If you revert to your old patterns, if the man I find in London is the cold, distant Duke, rather than the vulnerable, honest man who wrote these letters, I will leave. Not temporarily, permanently. I will seek a formal separation, and I will not be persuaded to return again. This is your one chance and mine. We will either rebuild our marriage into something real and sustaining, or we will end it with dignity and finality. I do not write this to be cruel, but to be clear. I have spent 3 years hoping you would change. I will not spend the rest of my life in that same hope. Either you have truly transformed, or we must both accept that our marriage was a mistake and determine how to proceed from that acceptance. I will arrive on Tuesday next in the afternoon. I do not expect you to meet the carriage, but I do expect you to be willing to dine with me that evening and begin the difficult work of determining whether what we destroyed can be rebuilt. I remain uncertain but willing. Catherine Alexander read the letter 3 times, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. She was giving him a chance. One chance. And if he failed, if he could not prove that his transformation was real, he would lose her forever. He had 1 week to prepare, 1 week to ensure that when Catherine returned, she would find not the man she had left, but the man he was becoming. Alexander spent that week in a frenzy of preparation that would have seemed absurd had anyone known its true purpose. He consulted with the housekeeper about Catherine's favorite flowers, ensuring that her apartments would be filled with them. He instructed the cook to prepare her preferred dishes. He went through her rooms himself, something the Duke of Ashford had never done in his entire tenure, and noticed things he had been blind to before. The books on her shelves were well worn, read and reread, poetry mostly, and novels of romance and adventure. He took note of the authors, the titles, thinking he might read them himself to better understand her mind. Her writing desk held correspondence with friends and family, carefully organized. He did not read the letters, that would be a violation, but he noticed how many there were, how much effort she put into maintaining connections he had never encouraged her to cultivate. On her dressing table was a miniature portrait of her parents, both deceased now, and a small sketch of her sister's children. Family she loved, family he had never made effort to know beyond the most cursory social obligations. He found, tucked in the back of a drawer, a handkerchief embroidered with his initials, something she must have made early in their marriage, a gift never given because the distance between them had grown too wide for such intimate offerings. The sight of it made him sink onto her bed, the handkerchief clutched in his fist, overcome with the weight of all he had squandered. But he could not dwell in regret. He had to focus on the future, on the man he needed to become. He went to jewelers and looked at rings, thinking perhaps a gift would speak what words could not. But each piece seemed inadequate, too material, too easy. Catherine did not need jewels. She needed something far more precious and far more difficult to give: his trust, his vulnerability, his whole heart. He visited his solicitor and made arrangements he hoped never to need. If Catherine ultimately chose separation, he wanted to ensure she would be financially secure, that she would have property in her own name, that she would never have to depend on his goodwill or his family's charity. It was the least he could do, to ensure that if she left him, she would do so with dignity and independence. The solicitor looked at him with barely concealed shock. Such arrangements were unusual, especially when no scandal or public breach existed. But Alexander did not explain. His marriage was his own concern, and he would protect Catherine whether or not she remained his wife. He wrote to Captain Ashworth. This letter was brief and difficult. "Captain, I write to inform you that my wife is returning to London next week. I do not presume to know what communication, if any, you have maintained with her. But I want you to understand that I intend to fight for my marriage with every resource at my command. I do not blame you for caring for Catherine. How could I, when her worth is so evident? But I am asking you, as one gentleman to another, to give me the opportunity to prove myself to her without interference. If I fail, and I acknowledge that is a possibility, then what happens between you and Catherine will be beyond my concern or control. But I am requesting that you not actively pursue her while I am attempting to rebuild what I have broken. This is not a demand. You owe me nothing, and Catherine owes me less. But I make this request in the hope that you might understand that a man deserves the opportunity to correct his mistakes, if correction is possible." A. Thornfield. He received no response, and did not expect one, but he had done what honor required. He had been honest about his intentions, and had asked for fair consideration. What Ashworth chose to do with that request was beyond Alexander's control. Tuesday arrived with brilliant sunshine, warm and golden, the sort of day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Alexander spent the morning in agitated distraction, unable to focus on anything, watching the clock as though he could will time to move faster or slower. He was not certain which. At 3 in the afternoon, he heard the carriage. He was in his study, having resolved not to meet her at the door, despite every instinct urging him to do so. She had said she did not expect it, and he would honor that, would not overwhelm her with attention before she was ready. He heard her voice in the entrance hall speaking to the staff, heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard her door close, and then silence. For 2 hours he waited, knowing she would need time to settle, to prepare herself for their evening together. He changed his own clothes 3 times, uncertain what to wear. Formal dinner attire seemed too distant, but casual. Clothing might suggest a lack of respect for the occasion. He finally settled on something in between, elegant but not forbidding. At 5 minutes before 6, he left his chambers and descended to the small dining room, not the grand formal space where they had entertained guests, but the intimate family room where a meal for 2 would not seem lost in cavernous grandeur. The table had been set beautifully. Candlelight, flowers, Catherine's favorite dishes prepared and waiting. Alexander stood beside his chair, his heart racing, and wondered if she would come, or if she would send word that she had changed her mind, that even this was too much, too soon. And then she appeared in the doorway. She wore a gown of soft lavender, simpler than her formal attire, but elegant nonetheless. Her hair was arranged simply, and she wore no jewelry except her wedding ring. She looked tired, Alexander thought, and uncertain, but also determined. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither spoke. "Catherine," Alexander said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "thank you for coming. Thank you for giving me this chance." She moved into the room, allowing him to hold her chair, sitting with the same graceful composure she had always possessed. "I said I would. I try to keep my word." The slight emphasis on "I" was not lost on Alexander, and he accepted the rebuke silently. He took his own seat, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the small table. "You look well," Alexander said. "Inadequate but true." "As do you," Catherine replied. "The separation has not been easy on either of us, I think." "No," Alexander agreed. "It has been the most difficult 6 weeks of my life." Catherine picked up her wineglass, but did not drink, merely held it as though needing something to do with her hands. "I read your letters." All of them. And? Alexander asked, unable to help himself. And I am here, Catherine said simply. I am willing to see if the man who wrote those letters is the man sitting across from me now, or if he was merely a fiction created by panic and desperation. He is real, Alexander said urgently. Catherine, I swear to you, everything I wrote was true. Alexander, she interrupted gently, I did not come here for more words. I came here for proof. Words are easy. They cost nothing but time and ink. Actions are what matter now. The way you treat me, the way you speak to me, the way you live with me day to day, that is what will determine whether we have a future. Alexander nodded, accepting this. Then tell me what you need. Tell me how I can prove myself to you. Catherine set down her wine glass and met his eyes directly. I need you to be present. Not physically present. You have always been that. But emotionally present. I need you to talk to me about your day, your concerns, your thoughts. I need you to ask about mine and actually listen to the answers. I need you to touch me. Not sexually, not yet, but simply touch me. Take my hand. Kiss my cheek. Put your arm around my waist when we walk. All the casual intimacies of marriage that you have denied us. I can do that, Alexander said. I want to do that. And I need you to let me into your heart, Catherine continued, her voice steady but her eyes revealing the difficulty of what she was saying. I need you to stop protecting yourself from me. Stop building walls. Stop treating your feelings as weaknesses to be hidden. I need you to be vulnerable with me. Alexander, because without that vulnerability we will never have more than a polite arrangement. And if I fail? Alexander asked quietly. If old habits assert themselves? If I retreat without meaning to? Then you must let me call you on it, Catherine said. You must accept correction, accept honesty even when it is uncomfortable. We will both need to be honest about what we are feeling, what we are struggling with. No more silence, no more assumption that the other person understands. We must talk, Alexander, about everything. I agree, Alexander said and meant it. I will do everything you ask. But Catherine, he paused, gathering courage, then reached across the table, his hand extended palm up in invitation. Catherine looked at his hand for a long moment, and Alexander's heart pounded, wondering if she would reject even this simple gesture. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. The touch was electric. Alexander felt it like lightning through his entire body. The warmth of her skin, the delicate bones of her fingers, the slight tremor that suggested she was not as composed as she appeared. He closed his hand around hers gently, carefully, as though she were something precious that might break if mishandled. I love you, he said quietly. I know I have said it in letters, but I want you to hear it now, face to face. I love you, Catherine. I have loved you for longer than I allowed myself to admit, and I will love you for the rest of my life, whether you ultimately choose to stay with me or not. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. I want to believe you. I want to believe that this time is different, that you have truly changed. But Alexander, I am afraid. I'm afraid of hoping again, of trusting again, only to have you retreat into your walls and leave me alone once more. Then let me prove it, Alexander said, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in a gesture of tenderness that felt both terrifying and right. However long it takes, whatever I need to do, let me show you that I am not the man I was, that I can be the man you need. They sat there for a long moment, hands joined across the table, candlelight flickering between them, the food growing cold on their plates, and then Catherine squeezed his hand gently before withdrawing hers. Let us eat, she said softly, and you can begin by telling me about your days while I was gone. Not the formal accounting you would give a business associate, but the truth. What you felt, what you thought, how you spent your time. So Alexander told her, about the visit to Richard's grave, about the hours spent in her apartments trying to understand her better, about the letters he had written late at night when he could not sleep for missing her. He told her about his conversation with Ashworth at the club, about the solicitor's visit, about the preparations he had made for her return. And Catherine listened, really listened, her eyes on his face, her expression softening gradually as he spoke. When he fell silent, she nodded slowly. That is good, she said. That is a beginning. They finished their meal with easier conversation, Catherine told him about her time in Hertfordshire, about her sister's family, about the countryside in spring. It was the sort of conversation they should have been having for 3 years, and Alexander drank in every word, every detail, trying to learn her in ways he had never allowed himself to do before. When the meal ended, Alexander walked her to the staircase. At the bottom of the stairs, Catherine paused and turned to face him. "Thank you for this evening," she said formally. "May I—" Alexander hesitated, then forced himself to continue. "May I kiss you goodnight? On the cheek, nothing more, just a gesture of affection." Catherine considered this for a moment, and Alexander held his breath, prepared for rejection. But then she nodded slightly. "Yes, you may." Alexander stepped closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm, and he could feel her pulse fluttering beneath his fingertips. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, and pressed his lips softly to her cheek. It was chaste, innocent, the sort of kiss a husband might give his wife 1,000 times over the course of a marriage. But for Alexander, it was profound. The first deliberate, affectionate touch he had allowed himself in years, and it made his chest ache with how much he had denied them both. "Good night, Catherine," he whispered against her skin. "Good night, Alexander," she replied, and there was something in her voice, not warmth, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of warmth to come. She ascended the stairs, and Alexander watched until she disappeared from view, then stood in the entrance hall for several minutes, his fingers touching the place where his lips had touched her skin, marveling at how something so simple could feel so monumental. It was a beginning, a tentative, fragile beginning, but it was more than he had dared to hope for. And as he returned to his own chambers that night, Alexander understood that the real work was only now starting. That one good evening did not undo 3 years of damage. That Catherine's willingness to try did not guarantee success. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander felt something that had been absent from his life for years. Hope. The days that followed established a new pattern. They breakfasted together each morning, took walks in the park in the afternoons, dined together in the evenings. Gradually, carefully, they began to rebuild what had been destroyed. Alexander told her things he had never shared with anyone. About his childhood insecurities, about the pressure of becoming a duke, about his fears and doubts. And Catherine, slowly, began to share her own inner life, her loneliness in the early years of their marriage, her attempts to win his affection, her gradual acceptance that those attempts were futile. Some of these conversations were painful. There were moments when Catherine would say something about how his behavior had hurt her, and Alexander would feel the weight of his failures pressing down on him like a physical force. But he had promised honesty, promised vulnerability, and so he did not defend himself or retreat. He simply listened, accepted, and apologized when apologies were appropriate. And gradually, so gradually, he almost did not notice it happening. Catherine began to soften toward him. She laughed at something he said over breakfast one morning, a genuine laugh rather than a polite acknowledgement of humor. She took his arm without being asked when they walked in the park. She lingered after dinner one evening, sitting with him in the library and reading while he attended to correspondence, simply sharing space in comfortable silence. 3 weeks after her return, Alexander woke early and, on impulse, went to the garden and cut an armful of roses, her favorite flower, the same roses she had been examining in the rain on the day they had argued months ago. He brought them to the breakfast room and left them beside her place setting before she arrived. When Catherine entered and saw the flowers, she stopped, her hand going to her throat. "You remembered," she said quietly. "I remember everything about you," Alexander replied. "I simply had not allowed myself to act on those memories before." Catherine touched the roses gently, then looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "They are beautiful, thank you." It was a small gesture, but it seemed to matter to her, and Alexander added it to his growing understanding of how to love this woman, with small, consistent actions rather than grand gestures, with attention to details she thought no one noticed, with the accumulation of ordinary kindnesses that built trust over time. 4 weeks after Catherine's return, they attended their first social event together, a small dinner party at the home of Lord and Lady Waverley. the couple who had visited Ashford months ago when everything was still fractured. Alexander was nervous as they prepared to leave, uncertain how they would navigate society as a couple when their reconciliation was still so new, so fragile. But Catherine seemed calm, and when they entered the Waverley home together, she placed her hand on his arm with a naturalness that made his heart soar. The evening proceeded smoothly until Captain Ashworth arrived. Alexander felt Catherine stiffen beside him as Ashworth entered the drawing room, and he understood that there had been correspondence between them, that Ashworth had not simply disappeared from her life during her time in Hertfordshire. Ashworth crossed the room directly to where they stood, and for a moment the three of them formed a strange tableau: the husband, the wife, the rival. "Your Grace," Ashworth said to Alexander, bowing correctly. Then to Catherine, "Duchess, I am glad to see you have returned to London." "Captain Ashworth," Catherine replied, her voice carefully neutral. "I trust you are well?" "Tolerably," Ashworth said, his eyes searching her face. "I wonder if I might have a word with you privately." Alexander felt every muscle in his body tense, but before he could respond, Catherine spoke. "Whatever you wish to say to me, Captain, may be said in front of my husband." Ashworth's eyes widened slightly, and he looked between them, seeming to reassess the situation. "I see. Then I will simply say that I hope you are content with your decision." "I am working on contentment," Catherine replied gently. "It is a process, not a destination. But yes, I am where I choose to be." The emphasis on choose was not lost on anyone. Ashworth nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted. Disappointment, perhaps, but also acceptance. "Then I wish you every happiness," he said, and sounded as though he meant it. He bowed to them both and moved away, and Alexander released a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Thank you," he said quietly to Catherine. "For what?" "For standing beside me, for making it clear that you have chosen to try rebuilding our marriage." Catherine looked up at him, and there was something vulnerable in her expression. "I am trying, Alexander, but you should understand. I did care for Captain Ashworth. I still do, in a way. He was kind to me when I was very lonely, and I will not pretend that his attention was unwelcome or meaningless." The words stung, but Alexander forced himself to accept them with the honesty they required. "I understand, and I am grateful that despite your feelings for him, you are giving me this opportunity." "The opportunity is not solely for your benefit," Catherine said. "I am doing this for myself as well, because I took vows and I want to honor them if possible, because we have a life and a household and responsibilities that matter, and because—" she hesitated, then continued, "because despite everything, I have not entirely stopped hoping that you might become the man I need you to be." It was not a declaration of love. It was not even a declaration of forgiveness, but it was honest, and it was enough. 6 weeks after Catherine's return, Alexander woke in the night to the sound of crying. He lay still for a moment, wondering if he had imagined it, but then it came again, muffled sobs from Catherine's adjacent chambers. Without thinking, he rose and went to the connecting door, which had remained closed for the entirety of their marriage. He knocked softly. "Catherine, are you all right?" The sobbing stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, "I am fine. Please go back to bed." But her voice was thick with tears, and Alexander found himself unable to simply return to his room and ignore her distress. "May I come in? Please." Another long pause. Then, "Very well." Alexander opened the door to find Catherine sitting up in bed, her face wet with tears, her arms wrapped around herself. Moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating her pale face and the evidence of her grief. "What is it?" Alexander asked, moving into the room but keeping a respectful distance. "What has upset you?" "It is nothing," Catherine said, wiping at her face. "A nightmare. It will pass." "Tell me about it," Alexander urged gently. "Please, let me help if I can." Catherine looked at him for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "I dreamed about our wedding night," she said quietly, "about how you touched me then, how tender you were. And then I dreamed about the months that followed, about watching you withdraw, about feeling you close yourself off from me piece by piece. And in the dream I was trying to reach you, but you kept moving further away until I could not see you anymore." The image broke Alexander's heart. He moved to sit on the edge of her bed, not touching her, but close enough that she would know he was there. "I am not moving away anymore," he said softly. "I am here, Catherine, and I am not going anywhere." "But what if you do?" Catherine asked, and her voice was small, vulnerable in a way he had never heard it. "What if this is temporary? What if in 6 months or a year you decide it is too difficult to be open, too frightening to be vulnerable? What if I let myself trust you again and you retreat back into your walls?" "I will not," Alexander said. "I promise you." "Catherine, I will not." "You cannot promise that," Catherine said, more tears sliding down her cheeks. "You cannot know what you will feel or do in the future." "You are right," Alexander admitted. "I cannot predict the future with certainty, but I can tell you this. I have tasted what life is like without your warmth, without your presence. I have lived in the cold emptiness I created, and I never want to return to it. The man I was before, distant, afraid, hiding, he was miserable, Catherine. Even when I did not fully realize it, I was slowly dying inside that prison I built." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. "I will make mistakes. I will have moments of fear or old habits asserting themselves. But when that happens, I am asking you to call me on it, to remind me of who I am trying to become, and I will listen. I will adjust. I will fight against those old patterns because the alternative, losing you, is unbearable." Catherine looked down, at their joined hands, then back up at his face. "I want to believe you." "Then believe me," Alexander said. "And if you cannot believe my words, watch my actions. Every day, Catherine, I will show you that I have changed. Every day, I will choose you. Choose vulnerability. Choose love over fear. For as many days as it takes for you to trust me again." Catherine was silent for a long moment, and then, to Alexander's shock, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder. Not quite an embrace, but a gesture of trust that made his eyes burn with unshed tears. "Stay," she whispered, "just for a little while, just until I fall asleep again. I do not want to be alone." "I will stay as long as you need me," Alexander replied, his arm coming around her shoulders carefully, ready to withdraw if she showed any sign of discomfort. But Catherine did not pull away. Instead, she relaxed against him, her breathing gradually slowing and deepening. And Alexander sat there in the moonlight, holding his wife for the first time in years, feeling her weight against him, her trust in his arms, and understood that this simple act of being present in her moment of vulnerability was more intimate than anything they had shared in their marriage thus far. When her breathing indicated she had fallen asleep, Alexander carefully, gently helped her lie back down, tucking the blankets around her with tender care. He stood looking down at her for a moment, at the woman he had hurt so deeply, and who was still miraculously willing to try again. Then he bent and pressed the softest of kisses to her forehead. "I love you," he whispered, "and I will prove it to you. Every day, for the rest of my life." He returned to his own chambers, but did not sleep, lying awake instead and thinking about trust, about vulnerability, about the long road ahead of them. They were not healed yet. They were not whole, but they were beginning, and that was everything. The true turning point came 2 months after Catherine's return, on a warm July evening. They had been to the opera, one of Catherine's favorite entertainments that Alexander had always found tedious, but now attended willingly for the pleasure of watching her face as she became absorbed in the music. On the carriage ride home, Catherine had been animated, discussing the performance with an enthusiasm Alexander found utterly captivating. When they arrived home, neither seemed ready to part for the evening. By unspoken agreement, they went to the library where a fire had been lit against the summer night's coolness. Catherine settled on the sofa with a book, and Alexander poured them each a brandy, then sat beside her, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her warmth. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Catherine reading, Alexander pretending to read, but actually watching her. And then, without quite knowing how it happened, he found himself speaking. "I went to your apartments today," he said quietly. "Not to intrude. Your maid was there, arranging flowers. But I stood in the doorway and I looked at the room, really looked at it, and I realized how little I know about you. about your preferences, your comforts, the things that make you feel at home. Catherine set down her book, giving him her full attention. And I realized, Alexander continued, that I have spent 3 years living in the same house with you, sleeping in the next room, taking meals at the same table, and I know almost nothing about who you truly are. I know the Duchess, competent, graceful, dutiful, but I do not know Catherine, the woman who chooses these books, who arranges flowers in particular ways, who keeps her parents' portrait beside her bed. What would you like to know? Catherine asked softly. Everything, Alexander said simply. Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your dreams when you were young. Tell me what you wanted from life before you married me. So, Catherine told him. She spoke of growing up in a small manor house in Derbyshire, of a father who encouraged her to read widely and think independently, of a mother who taught her that kindness was the highest virtue. She spoke of her first season in London, of feeling overwhelmed and uncertain, of the pressure to make an advantageous match. I met Captain Ashworth that season, she said, and Alexander tensed but forced himself to listen without judgment. He was charming, and I enjoyed his company. But then you were introduced to me at Lady Pemberton's garden party, and she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. I was captivated by you in a way I had not been by anyone else. You were serious, intense, clearly intelligent. I thought I saw depth in you that others lacked. You were not wrong, Alexander said quietly. The depth was there. I simply refused to let you access it. Catherine nodded. When you proposed, I was thrilled. I thought I was so fortunate. To be chosen by a duke, yes. But more than that, to be chosen by a man I found genuinely fascinating. I imagined what our marriage would be like. I imagined conversations like this, evenings spent in companionable silence, growing to know each other over the years. And I gave you none of that, Alexander said, the guilt pressing down on him. No, Catherine agreed. You gave me courtesy and distance, and I convinced myself it was my fault, that I had been too demanding, too romantic in my expectations. I tried to be what I thought you wanted. Quiet, undemanding, invisible when you seemed to need space. You were perfect, Alexander said fiercely. You were exactly what I needed, and I was too afraid to accept it. Catherine looked at him, and in her eyes was a question. And now, are you still afraid? Alexander considered this honestly. Yes, he admitted. I am terrified. I am terrified of failing you again, of reverting to old habits, of not being strong enough or brave enough to sustain this change. But I am. More afraid of losing you than I am of the vulnerability that loving you requires. And that shift in my fear, is what tells me this is real. Catherine reached out and took his hand, and Alexander's heart leaped at the voluntary touch. I am afraid too, she confessed. Afraid of being hurt again. Afraid of letting myself love you fully, and discovering that you cannot sustain the intimacy I need. Then let us be afraid together, Alexander said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her, knuckles gently. Let us build something new, brick by brick, day by day, not the marriage we had, which was built on my fear and emotional cowardice, but a true marriage, built on honesty and trust, and the willingness to be vulnerable with each other. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I would like that. Catherine, Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion, may I kiss you? Not on the cheek, not a gesture of courtesy, but truly kiss you, as a husband kisses his wife? Catherine drew in a shaky breath, and for a moment Alexander thought she would refuse, but then she nodded, her eyes never leaving his. Alexander cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, to pull away, but she did not pull away. She met him halfway, her lips touching his, with a softness that made his entire body ache. The kiss was tender, gentle, nothing demanding or aggressive. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a hope. And when they finally drew apart, both were trembling. I love you, Alexander whispered against her lips. I love you, Catherine, not because I am afraid of losing you, though I am, not because another man wanted you, though that forced me to face truths I was avoiding, but because you are kind and intelligent and patient, because you play Chopin with such emotion it makes my chest ache, because you care for people with a tenderness I have never possessed, Because you are you, and I am hopelessly, helplessly in love with every part of who you are." Catherine's tears flowed freely now, but she was smiling through them. "I love you too," she said, and the words struck Alexander with the force of revelation. "I have loved you since the beginning, through all the hurt and disappointment. I tried to stop loving you, tried to protect myself by withdrawing my heart, but I could not do it. Even when I was angry, even when I had given up. Hope I still loved you. And now I'm choosing to love you openly, without protection, without walls. I am choosing to trust you with my heart again." Alexander pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly, burying his face in her hair. "I will not fail you," he promised. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life earning the trust you are placing in me." They held each other for a long time, the fire crackling beside them, the house silent around them. And when Catherine finally pulled back slightly to look up at him, there was a question in her eyes. "Will you stay with me tonight?" she asked softly. Not necessarily for intimacy, though I would welcome that if you desire it, but simply to sleep beside me, to hold me, to be present in a way you have not been since our wedding." "There is nothing I want more," Alexander said honestly. So they went upstairs together, hand in hand, and for the first time in years, Alexander entered Catherine's chambers not as a visitor but as a husband. They helped each other undress with shy tenderness, years of distance making them uncertain with each other. But the uncertainty was not unpleasant. It felt like the beginning they should have had, like the wedding night they had been denied by Alexander's fear. When they finally lay together in Catherine's bed, Alexander pulled her into his arms and held her, feeling her heart beating against his chest, her breath warm against his neck, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander felt complete. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Catherine asked sleepily. "For giving me a second chance, for being brave enough to trust me again, for loving me despite all the reasons you have not to." Catherine was silent for a moment, then said softly, "Love is not about deserving, Alexander. It is not a reward for good behavior or a punishment withheld for failures. It simply is. And I love you, not because you have earned it, but because my heart recognized something in you from the very beginning, and it has never stopped recognizing it, even when you were hiding it from both of us." Alexander felt tears slip from his eyes, dampening her hair. "I will be worthy of that love," he promised. "I will spend my life trying to be worthy of it." "Then I will spend my life loving you," Catherine replied, and there was such certainty in her voice, such peace, that Alexander finally allowed himself to believe it might be true. They made love that night, slowly, tenderly, with a depth of emotion that transformed the physical into something transcendent. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in the moonlight, Alexander understood that this vulnerability, this connection, this willingness to be fully seen and fully known, was what Richard had tried to tell him all those years ago, that the love was worth the risk, that to live fully was to love fully, regardless of the fear, regardless of the possibility of loss, that to be human was to be vulnerable, and to deny that vulnerability was to deny life itself. The months that followed were not without challenges. There were moments when Alexander felt the old fear rising, felt the instinct to retreat into emotional safety, but each time he forced himself to push through that fear, to stay present, to choose vulnerability over protection, and Catherine, for her part, held him accountable. When she sensed him withdrawing, she called him on it gently but firmly, refusing to let him slip back into old patterns. They talked through difficulties rather than avoiding them. They argued sometimes, with passion and honesty, and then reconciled with equal passion. They learned each other slowly, discovering preferences and histories and dreams they had never shared. They took a trip to the Lake District and walked together through wild landscapes, holding hands and talking for hours. They hosted dinners at Ashford House, and their guests commented on the obvious affection between them, the way they looked at each other, the gentle touches that spoke of genuine intimacy. Lady Waverley pulled Catherine aside at one such dinner and said with tears in her eyes, "I am so happy to see you both this way. I will confess I worried about you in those early years, but now you seem truly happy." "I am," Catherine had replied simply. "We both are." 6 months after their reconciliation, on a cold December evening, Catherine told Alexander she was pregnant. He felt the news strike him with physical force. Joy and terror intermingled in equal measure. All his fears about his brother, about loss, about the vulnerability of loving, they all came rushing back in that moment. Catherine saw it in his face immediately. "Talk to me," she said firmly. "Do not retreat into fear. Tell me what you are feeling." So Alexander told her about his terror of losing her, as Richard had lost Eloise, about the panic that came with knowing she would be at risk, about all the irrational fears that pregnancy evoked. Catherine listened patiently, then took his face in her hands. "I am not Eloise," she said gently, "and you are not Richard. We are ourselves, Alexander, and we will face whatever comes together, with the best doctors, with care and caution, and most importantly with love and trust in each other." "I am afraid," Alexander admitted, tears in his eyes. "I know," Catherine said, "and I love you for being honest about that fear. But Alexander, do not let fear steal our joy. We are going to have a child, our child, and that is cause for celebration, not terror." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly, feeling her body warm and alive against his. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "Good," Catherine said, pulling back to smile at him. "That terror means you understand what you have, that you know how precious this is, how fortunate we are to have found our way back to each other." The pregnancy progressed without complication, and in July Catherine gave birth to a healthy son. Alexander was with her throughout the labor, unconventional, but Catherine had insisted, and Alexander had not been able to refuse her anything. He held her hand through the pain, whispered encouragement, and when the midwife finally placed their son in Catherine's arms, Alexander wept openly with relief and joy. "What shall we name him?" Catherine asked, looking up at Alexander with exhausted happiness. Alexander looked at his son, perfect, tiny, alive, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. "Richard," he said quietly, "if you agree, I would like to name him Richard, for my brother, because I finally understand what Richard tried to tell me. That love is worth every risk, every fear, every moment of vulnerability." Catherine smiled through her own tears. "Richard it is. Richard Thornfield, future Duke of Ashford." As Alexander held his wife and son in the dawn light, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, the years of fear and avoidance, the pain he had caused, the near loss of everything that mattered. He thought about the man he had been and the man he had become, and he understood, finally, that his brother's tragedy had not been about the danger of love. It had been about the preciousness of it, about how love, even when it ends in loss, is the thing that makes life worth living. Alexander had almost missed that truth, had almost destroyed his marriage and his chance at happiness because he was too afraid to reach for what mattered most. But Catherine had given him a second chance, had loved him through his fear and his failures, had been brave enough to trust him again when trust seemed impossible. And now, holding his family in his arms as London awakened beyond the windows, Alexander made a silent promise to his wife, to his son, to the ghost of his brother. He would never again take this love for granted. He would never again hide behind walls of fear and duty. He would live fully, love completely, and treasure every ordinary moment of the extraordinary life they were building together. Because that was what Richard had tried to teach him all along, that life was not measured in years survived, but in love given freely, in risks taken bravely, in the willingness to be vulnerable, even knowing that vulnerability could lead to pain. And Alexander Thornfield, 7th Duke of Ashford, had finally learned that lesson, not from his brother's death, but from his wife's patience, not from tragedy, but from redemption, not from fear, but from love.